On today's episode, I learn why the media should just leave Joe Biden alone, why high gas prices globally are the fault of capitalism, and how drag shows have absolutely nothing to do with sexuality. This is Cringe Posts. Hello friends, welcome to this episode of the Cringe Posts podcast. This is the show where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that you find in your social media feeds. We break down where they went wrong, what is the underlying assumptions they make that aren't quite right, and of course we laugh along the way. My name is Donald, my co-host Britt is out today, so it's going to be a bit of a shorter episode with me looking over a couple of posts that I found cringy, and then we'll be on our merry way. As always, if you can leave a like and comment and subscribe and all those good things, it really helps us in the algorithm, really helps us grow, which we appreciate. And if you want to see these posts visually and you are not on our YouTube channel or Odyssey channel, feel free to go to cringeposts.com and we will have the slides updated there for you with the posts featured in this episode. Now, before we make fun of other people's posts, we always gotta reflect on our own bad, cringy posts from the past. And so we're going to look at one of my old posts here that reads, and this is October of 2012. Wow, Inslee is being super bipartisan. He keeps bringing up how terrible Republicans are. Real classy. And of course, Inslee is the governor of Washington State, and he was the candidate at the time, I believe. This would have been right before the election. And I found this kind of cringy because in the way that I'm phrasing things, Inslee is being super bipartisan, sarcastically. But of course, bipartisan is not really a good merit. You know, when you think about the duopoly of the Republicans and the Democrats, ultimately they're both authoritarian, and the difference between them and actual human liberty is so like the chasm is so vast between liberty and both of these parties, and the difference between these parties is pretty narrow, relatively speaking. And so it's just funny because usually the worst bills are the ones that are bipartisan, the ones that both members of parties come together on. In almost all cases, there are agreements for increased spending, increased government control, a new program, a new branch, whatever it is. Usually it means less human liberty, more bureaucracy, and slower and worse outcomes. So at this point, I don't think I'd given up the Republican title, but so I was, still a partisan there and feeling the angst of, oh wow, Inslee's trying to appeal to everyone and he's not even being bipartisan. But of course, I don't think that I would have been cheering if Rob McKenna, the Republican candidate at the time, had been saying complimentary things about Democrats. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy there too. Easy to bash the other team for not including yours when they're speaking, but you're not so willing when it's your team that's speaking to compliment the others. But of course, that's also irrelevant when you think about how ineffectual the difference between Republicans and Democrats can be. So just a little bit of cringe there. But now let's move on to other cringe posts. So like I said, we're going to do a little bit of a shorter one. So I've just got 3 posts today, although one of them is longer, and I'll sort of give my thoughts on those and what makes them cringe. So the first one is a headline from The Atlantic, and the tweet reads, "In today's Atlantic Daily, Radio Free Tom defends President Joe Biden as he faces criticism from Republicans and Democrats alike." And it's funny because this post I just critiqued from myself, I was saying how bipartisanship is usually a bad thing. And what's great is this is one of those examples where a lot of criticisms from Republicans and Democrats alike are justified. They're not always the same thing, but Biden is a pretty ineffectual, hapless leader. I mean, for all you want to say about him, he's done a few okay things, but for the most part, he's spent more than any other president in history. He really hasn't done that much to withdraw our foreign intervention. He's ramped up this war, as much intervention as we have had in the Ukraine-Russian bit has been amped by the president's position. He's stoked more, hostile talk by declaring Taiwan as its own country, which again, I recognize the sovereignty of Taiwan, but if you're already in a tense foreign policy environment, you probably don't want to be stoking the fires unnecessarily on things like that when you're talking about a massive global power like China. So Biden has done pretty poor, and then of course there's him not allowing energy independence and the massive inflation that's happened both from the Trump and what will soon happen from the Biden economies. And so you look at this guy Radio Free Tom, who is a opinion writer for The Atlantic, I believe, and he's defending him on all these moderate grounds. And it's just really funny because, man, the the media used to at least try to hold the view from the public that they held the government's feet to the fire, that they held people accountable. And frankly, I don't think they ever really did that unless it was expedient for them and the machine of power. But even now, they're not even trying to put on that facade of holding people accountable. When you get these puff pieces like "Leave Joe Biden alone," that's the title. I didn't even read that. I don't think that's the title of this piece, and it's just funny because of all things to say about Joe Biden, as a title, "Leave Joe Biden alone" is so cringe. Because if anything, you should say, Joe Biden is actually good, or Joe Biden has done things right. You when you're making these cases, you want to assert the things that he's done positively if you're going to defend him, instead of this wimpy, lackluster "Leave Joe Biden alone." Like, no, the entire atmosphere revolves around calling out bad actors and calling out government bloat and build up and all these kinds of things. And so for your defense to be "Leave Joe Biden alone," it's a little pathetic, I think. And of course, you would, not to sort of bring the whataboutism aspect, but it is really striking to think, I don't remember if it was, I think it was The Atlantic tried to hire Kevin Williamson, who was, I believe, I'm not sure if he was the editor of National Review Online, or at least a part of National Review Online and National Review. He was one of those semi-libertarian-ish conservative writers, a little too conservative and Republican-y for my taste, but I read his stuff because it was sometimes interesting. It wasn't exactly the most cut and dry, conservative ink talking point. So, he was at least a little bit interesting. And The Atlantic, I believe it was The Atlantic, hired him. And the uproar from the left was just insane, to the point where within, I want to say, the week, if not sooner, he got let go because of this insane backlash about some of the mean things he'd said. And really, when you look at the grand scale of things, referring to that sort of chasm between Republicans, Democrats, and then the values of liberty, on the scale of things that he said that were controversial or offensive, it's just so pathetically small and minor compared to the actual ideas that challenge the status quo. But the idea that so many people have is that you have to cancel and shrink the Overton window. You can't be talking about the ideas like, what if government is a corrupt institution from its core and it will never work? That's entirely outside the Overton window realm of discussion. They have to keep it in. And so someone saying things like, I think he got in trouble for abortion comments, if I recall correctly. So saying something like abortion is wrong because it's murder, that's pushing the Overton window. So you got to clamp down and cancel that. Otherwise, you might have people, further questioning things like, why are we having government support and government sanctioned money going to Planned Parenthood organizations and private institutions that carry out these kinds of horrific things, stuff like that. So it's just funny because The Atlantic is very, they're not exactly principled when it comes to the balance of who they're going to let speak. So this wishy-washy moderate defending Joe Biden going in, as long as what you say is tame and it doesn't upset the status quo and it doesn't make anyone really think or challenge themselves, maybe it makes them, just sort of lulls them into a nice sense of security that, no, Joe Biden is okay. We all are okay. Never mind the inflation on the walls. Never mind the teetering on intervention in Ukraine and Russia. Never mind the fact that he, has basically a brain aneurysm anytime he gets in front of a microphone. It's going to be okay. As long as you speak like that, then you're welcome at the Atlantic. But if you try to push the envelope even to the tiniest degree, you're not welcome. Okay, let's move on to the next cringe post. And this one, it shows a listing of the price per gallon in US dollars of gasoline by country. And it lists them out, some international ones. So it shows Hong Kong, $10.96. Norway, $9.64. Denmark, $9.32. Central African Republic, $9.03. Monaco, $8.93. Finland, $8.89. Iceland, $8.75. And Greece, $8.70. And the caption from the person who posted this reads, "Capitalism did this to you, not the president." And I love this because, it's almost as if there's this idea that two things cannot be true at the same time. So let's grant for a second that it is capitalism. The problem. Could it not also be that Joe Biden has done things in the economy that have made it a more expensive price globally? Or that it has made it more expensive in the US than it otherwise would have been? Just kind of funny there. But of course, it's capitalism in this person's mind when you stop trading with oil partners in the name of supporting a non-democracy across the world. It's capitalism when you inflate the global reserve currency, which, affects prices globally, of course. And it's capitalism to shut down energy projects that restrict the global oil supply. All of those things are capitalism, right? Government action and intervening into the market. These things are capitalism, of course, which is causing all these price rises, which is just an absurd notion. There's always this insane level of projection when it comes to things like inflation or gas prices where, Austrian economics people and free marketers have been warning about these things for years and talking about the causes and then seeing us make the mistakes that will cause this to happen. And then it happens. And then people like this just come out and say, it's capitalism. When it's like, no, clearly we were predicting this and it only happened after you printed so much money or stopped these energy projects in the US. And that's the crazy thing to me too, is to think, when this person, she says that capitalism did this to you, not the president. I don't know this person well enough to pose the question, but I would love to ask, do you think that Joe Biden would you say that he's ineffective at achieving his ends, or that he lied when he said that he was achieving the ends? Meaning, of course, on the campaign trail, he said that he was going to make the energy companies pay and that he was going to run them out of business. And so the two outcomes that you have here is if, capitalism did this and not the president, which I think it's more than just the president, right? I don't think it's just Biden. I think it's also Congress and Donald Trump's administration and on all these factors, all these regulations and regulators that have increased and decreased things, increased the money supply, decreased the energy supply. So it isn't just the president, to be fair, but he is culpable and guilty. So anyway, back to my point. I'd love to ask the question, on the campaign trail, when he's promised to make the energy companies pay and suffer and put them out of business, was he ineffectual at doing that and the gas prices went up in spite of his inability to do anything? Or was he lying on the campaign trail and he didn't mean that and it just happened anyway? Because the point is, he made the promise that he was going to try to enact policies and regulations and sign bills that would put them out of business. And then we're in a spot where they're raising prices crazy. So to completely deflect from Joe Biden is silly. But of course, we also have to recognize the fact that when you inflate the global reserve currency by spending these massive bailout bills that we did during the COVID years, of course, it's going to affect the global, the global exchange rates. It's going to increase the global pricing on goods when, a major, when the reserve currency, becomes less valuable, goods become relatively more expensive. And then you compound that, you compound that with the antagonizing of Russia, who now was a massive supplier of energy and oil and those kinds of things. And so then they're not selling to a bunch of various countries. And so, of course, the price is going to shoot up globally. Now, the prices of gas in the US, of course, were skyrocketing before the Ukraine invasion. So it's not even to say that that's the only cause. Now, that's been a dramatic cause of it, but you can look at the data and you can see that, in the Biden administration, the price of oil and gas did increase. And I think some of that had to do with inflation from the Trump years, but some of it has to do with the anti-energy rhetoric and regulation that Biden threatens, which makes, in a free market, you don't have a powerful government who can come in and shut down companies for no other reason than they're the government. So in a free market, if an energy company sees an opportunity to expand or to get in to the market, they'll do so, which will create more supply and lower prices. But when you have this bully pulpit coming out saying, if we're going to make them go out of business. Well, if I'm looking to invest, I don't want to invest in energy companies because I think they're going to be going out of business. And so that's a crazy thought. So that's just one way right there where Biden doesn't have to do anything policy-wise. There doesn't have to be any mass amounts of foreign intervention or global happenings for Biden to negatively affect the price of gas and oil. And of course, none of that has to do with capitalism. If this was capitalism's fault, well, then how come we didn't have $10 a gallon gas like 3 years ago? If this was just the market forces working and realizing they could rip people off, how come you just didn't have all of the gas companies simultaneously raising prices? And it's because, of course, they're reactionary just like any other market to what people are willing to pay. And if your competitor raises their prices, you have an opportunity to take their market share. So, again, a very silly assertion. And the last thing I'll say, I guess, is, when Biden says that he's going to run these energy companies out of business or that we have an opportunity to move to a renewable energy economy and all these kinds of things, we've been saying on this show, and I've been saying for longer than the show, that when you talk about things like going to entirely renewable energy, you're talking about trade-offs. And to say that, well, we're killing the planet with all of these, fossil fuel type things, well, the way that it is now, we're literally killing the human population if you tried to move everyone away from this kind of energy right now into renewable. We just don't have the capacity for renewable energy. We don't have the electrical grid. So much of our electricity and power is made through these kinds of older fuels anyway, that there's just not enough green, clean energy collected right now at an efficient enough rate that moving there is feasible. And that's why you see, crazy increases in energy prices. You see crazy increases in food production, because when you have gas and energy costs increase, that means everything gets more expensive because we primarily use energy to generate a lot of things in the economy. And so all of these factors contribute. And so you have to recognize that if you want to move to an entirely 100% renewable energy economy, well, you're going to kill a lot of people in the way. You're going to starve them. You're going to make it so they can't afford living. You're going to increase your homeless population. You're going to turn normal, productive citizens into reliant, feeble people who are unable to provide for themselves because the opportunity is not there because things are too expensive and you've devalued the currency too much. It's a crazy outcome that we're seeing in front of us due to these effects, and then people want to look the other way and blame capitalism, not the actual causes, which is reducing the supply of energy and preventing energy from being accrued. Absolutely wild. And I think that we need to expand and let people collect energy on the states, especially as better technologies come out for doing so that make it more clean and more responsible. Okay. And the last post we have here is a very long one, so it's gonna actually come in sort of two posts, but it's one big script text. But I thought it was interesting because we're more on this culture war and the drag shows, and that's kind of fun here, because this is what someone might think is a very nuanced take, a very intelligent take that makes some very basic wrong assumptions that I wanted to help highlight. So the post reads, "Thoughts on the whole children shouldn't see drag performances uproar. First off, I hope this is all a made-up false conflict that has been orchestrated as a distraction by the wealthy elite. And I hope we can just see through that nonsense sometime soon so we can all band together for a better quality life better quality of life for all. The conspiracy theory is so much easier to mentally handle than the simple ugliness of fear and hate. Okay, I think the way I'm actually going to talk about this, since it's so long, is I think I'm going to break it down bit by bit. So notice in the first part she says children shouldn't see drag performances. That's a kind of neutral way of stating it. So I'm not going to ding it that much, but recognize that it's not even that children shouldn't see drag performances is what caused the uproar. The uproar was events designed for kids that are drag performances that are sexual, right? Like, we're talking about drag time story hour, or drag queen story hour, story time in public libraries. We're talking about drag your family to pride events, where it's not even that people are voluntarily bringing their children in inappropriate settings that are sexual. It's events that are specifically trying to impress upon young minds in a totally inappropriate manner sexual things, okay? And we'll get onto this later with some of the examples she uses. But the very fact that they are sexual events and the fact that they're designed to bring in children is the big problem. Now, of course, I have just as much concern if you're voluntarily, as a parent, bringing your kid to a drag show that is sexual and stripping in nature and those kinds of things. That's obviously a problem too. But the uproar is over these ones that are specifically ensnared to bring kids in, and with of course the worst example being that proposed legislation from the legislator in California, who said that he's going to make it a mandatory requirement, and story time drag queen hour would fulfill that credit requirement. And then in the next paragraph that I read, I hope it's not a made up false conflict. I agree with that, actually. Like, it would be awesome if this was entirely a distraction, that, the vast majority of people did not want this happening and recognize that children should be absolutely nowhere near sexual themes like this. Like, that's entirely inappropriate. The fact that there are people defending this is insane. Unfortunately, we come to the last little line there, and it seems that this person and I split in our understandings. They hope it's a conspiracy because everyone should just be okay with drag, and I think that it should be I hope that it's a conspiracy because it's so obvious that kids should not be sexualized. But yeah, I mean, let's be real. Like, the culture wars in general, I think, are important battles to stake out your claim of virtuous men, because as much as we advocate for a lack of government and individual liberty, these things don't stand on their own unless you have people who are willing to uptake that mantle and to be virtuous, to not use force, and to not try to coalesce a coalition of people to use force against their neighbor. That's how liberty works, and you absolutely need strong cultural institutions to do that. And of course, the start of that is to not have kids sexualized. That's a pretty good pillar in virtuous cultural hegemony. Okay, back to the post. Now, the fact of the matter is that drag is entrenched into our culture. And I don't just mean queer culture. I mean mainstream cis-het media. Cisgendered, heterosexual, or heteronormative. Sure, there's the obvious RuPaul's Drag Race, but also drag has, for better or worse, been a comedy trope for ages. Stage plays, TV, movies, arguably even goes back to the origins in Greek theater, where women were not allowed to be performers, so men played roles of women. Shakespeare, too. The term drag comes from the Victorian era, if you want to get technical, so it's been around since the late 1800s. Without breaking down all the performance history, there are surely a few examples of gender nonconforming or gender performative artists, folks, musicians, or jokes you can think of, too. How all of these portrayals affect how society affects trans folks is certainly something to be discussed, and certainly is intertwined with the reasons for conservatives to be doing this awful transphobic stuff. But okay, let's look at drag as we know it, and as I've grown up with it. Okay, gonna analyze this one too here. So, this person, I think it's a she, I actually don't know, brings up all these examples of historical drag, and there will be more coming up, so I won't spend super time. But it's a different context. It's entirely different. When the Greek theater was happening, where women were not allowed to be performers, and when Shakespeare was doing these performances, like, children may have been in there, but they weren't doing these things in an overtly sexual way. The jokes that were sexual in these plays and things like that were usually in a double entendre form, so the adults would get it and the children wouldn't. Even in those contexts, the idea is that you don't let kids know about the joke you're making because it's sexual. So there's even then a sexual separation. Now, I also don't think that you should look and say that, like, you know, just because historically these things have existed means that they're a great thing now. I would not take my cues on virtue and how we should run society from the Greeks. They did terrible things to their children in many cases, and their sexual ethic was not great. I mean, and like think about the Romans and stuff like that too, right? So this is just a weak argument to say it has existed in the past. Okay, like child sacrifice has existed in the past. It's been part of culture for a long time. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing that we should recognize and value. That's a terrible argument, and it's not even fleshed out. I don't even know if this person knows they're really making that argument, to be honest with you. It's just so poorly fleshed out. Okay, but there's more I want to say on this, but the content sort of hits it a little deeper, so we'll move on. Disney, notorious for being media for children, even has drag. In Lion King, there's a bit where Timon says, "What do you want me to do? Dress up in drag and do the hula?" And in the stage play, which is currently playing at the Fabulous Fox, it's the Charleston, one of my favorite parts, TBH, the puppets puts on the most fabulous peak sequined flapper dress complete with feather hairband. It's silly. It's one of the iconic parts. What are you anti-drag folks canceling or calling for kids to not see Lion King, or that to be removed from the story? What silly diversion do you want so that Simba can go fight Scar and claim his rightful throne? Come on now. Okay, this example is a particular example where the idea is mocked. The idea is, what do you want me to do? Do the most outrageous thing? And it suggests it. Now, first, I don't think Disney also is a good arbiter of what should morality be. Disney more and more has been overtly sexual and overtly progressive in its themes. And I don't like Disney. And so again, you're using standards that no one actually wants to abide by. No one says, well, if Disney does it, then it's okay. Our standards are sexuality should not be pushed on kids. And so this little example in Lion King is not really sexual in nature. It really isn't. The idea is it's sort of like, do you want to do something outrageous and goofy? It's meant to elicit a laugh from kids because it's so outrageous and silly and goofy and not normal, right? The only reason the joke works is because it's not normal. If it were normal, then that wouldn't make sense. That would be like the line saying, what do you want me to do? Put on a suit and tie and and present a business meeting? Like, that wouldn't be funny. That would be like, what? That's sure you could do that. I don't get it. So there's so many aspects of it. So like, one, Disney's not the moral arbiter for what we want to be expressed. Two, what they express isn't sexual. And three, the very nature of it has to be abnormal for the joke to work and to land in that context. Okay, back to the post. But for me, the drag performance that most hugely impacted my life is Mrs. Doubtfire. We know it, we love it. I remember as a kid loving the little montage where Robin Williams is trying on these different wigs and looks and having so much fun with the gay uncles with character work. And the movie is just loaded with painfully funny mishaps about this dad trying to act as this old British woman. We all love the "oh hello" frosting faced from the fridge, bits plopping in the tea or coffee. But you know what's really the important takeaway for me? That a parent, went through all this effort to see his kids during a difficult time for him and the family, and take care of them. That's the real heart of the story. And why it is especially so impactful to me is because I remember thinking my dad would do something like that for me and my brothers. As a kid, I thought my dad had a sense of humor and a bit of likeness to like Robin Williams too. Well, guess what, folks? My parents got divorced, and I could parse out for you which childhood memories and sentiments came when, but that movie was a reassuring idea through everything. And at the end of the movie, where the Mrs. Doubtfire character says, on the TV program for the family and for everyone to see, that just because parents are separating doesn't mean they don't love you, don't even try to tell me that this is something a kid shouldn't see. And for me, yeah, that hits, especially since the late letter was from a Katie. Oh, my dear Katie, you know some parents, when they're angry, they get along much better when they don't live together. And they don't fight all the time. And they can become better people and much better mummies and daddies for you. And sometimes sometimes they get back together, and sometimes they don't, dear. And if they don't blame yourself. Just because they don't love each other anymore doesn't mean that they don't love you. There are all sorts of different families, Katie. But if there's love, dear, those are the ties that bind, and you'll have a family in your heart forever. All my love to you, Poppet. You're going to be all right. Bye-bye. Okay. Let's talk about this real briefly to wrap up. This is an entire misdirection of the argument. Not once, note, does she actually address any of the complaints that people have. No one has said, your kids shouldn't see Mrs. Doubtfire. Now, for what it's worth, I think the message that your parents can still love you in a divorce is a good one. I also don't think celebrating the idea of divorce is a good one. I think there are some instances where, a divorce might be necessary, but I don't think that that's something that should be celebrated. Now, reassuring the kid that your parents can still love you through that is a good thing, but that's entirely separate from the idea of promoting drag. This is a great case of someone taking an example of, here's a good thing, and then pairing it with this other thing that is included. Here's a different aspect of that thing. What, you hate the good thing? And it's to say, no. One, I don't really have that much of a problem with Mrs. Doubtfire. I probably wouldn't really want to, show it to my kids necessarily. I don't think it's the greatest show, but if that's what we're talking about, I would be fine. I don't think there should be any kind of a ban from kids seeing Mrs. Doubtfire, because Mrs. Doubtfire is not a sexual overt thing. Mrs. Doubtfire is not a drag show. It is not a drag show where kids are putting dollars in underwear of these people. That is not going on. That's not what Mrs. Doubtfire is about. And the entire sort of breakdown of Mrs. Doubtfire here proves that it's about something entirely else, and it uses this drag sort of persona to illustrate the means of the message. Now, again, if we were talking about these shows being a Mrs. Doubtfire thing, I probably wouldn't have that much of a problem with it. I probably wouldn't choose to expose my kids to it, but again, the entire joke of Mrs. Doubtfire in many ways rests on the humor of a guy being an old British woman, something he is not, something that is abnormal, irregular, goofy, outrageous. The movie doesn't land as a comedy if what he is doing is a normal thing to do. I mean, imagine in the reverse, imagine you have a mom and a dad and they get divorced, the kids go with the dad, and then the mom just dresses up in a different wig as a different mom, as a maid, and comes in. That wouldn't have the same humorous effect. The entire shock factor is the fact that there is something abnormal happening in order for that to be funny. And then everything that this person says and venerates and lauds as a good virtue and value has nothing to do with drag, has nothing to do with the complaints that people have about the sexualization of children. And this is a very common thing from a lot of these cringe posts, is they take the very shell of the idea, they take the very most surface level aspect of it, and then compare and look at all the complaints, and they take the surface level ones and compare that to an entirely different aspect of what we're complaining about, or assuming that because this surface level thing over here is good, you must denounce or use that as your standard. You have to denounce everything else or use that as your standard for virtue. So because the message of parents still being able to love their kids amidst a divorce is a good one, therefore you must accept every aspect of that movie, which means you have to accept drag. And it also means you have to accept every aspect of drag, which means these drag shows that are designed for children, where they're having kids put dollar bills in underwears of strippers. That's just a false argument tactic. It's a fallacy. Don't let people do that when you're talking about these issues, or you see these posts and you're wondering I like those messages of, I think that's a good lesson for a kid to learn. And Mrs. Doubtfire wasn't all that bad. It's, first of all, Mrs. Doubtfire you don't have to think the message is wrong to think that the drag is inappropriate in Mrs. Doubtfire. I don't think it is, but you can think that, right? You can say that it's a good message, but the means they get there is done poorly. So yeah, you absolutely can say you shouldn't have your kid watching it. I actually think the same thing about the movie The Goonies. I watched it later in my life, and I think that as an adventure story for kids, I think it would be magical. But there's also things in there, like some profanity, some themes, where I'm like, I actually wouldn't want my kids seeing this. I think that would be the age where this would be magical for them. These themes are too mature for them to hear or to see or to be impressed upon. So I wouldn't want that for my kid. So you can hold two trains of thought at once. You don't have to think one thing in the movie is a good thing, therefore I have to accept all of it. We don't define our virtue and our morality and our principles by media. We don't say, oh well, you know what, Mrs. Doubtfire had a good message, therefore I have to support drag in all cases. That's way more of a burden than you have to accept, and don't let people fool you like that. Okay, that's the episode for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate it. I hope you guys like and comment and subscribe, all that. Share it with a friend if you're enjoying it. I would really, really appreciate that. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.